Chapter 5, The Yellow Shank. Here are the stats from the last 2 weeks of October. 3 fights in the downstairs hall, no wins, 1 loss, 2 ties. Mr. Ferris stopped them. 1 fight in Mr. McElroy's class with barbarian hordes, a tie. Mr. McElroy stopped it. 2 fights in the upstairs hall, no wins, 1 loss, 1 tie. Mr. Ferris stopped it. 2 fights in the PE locker room, 2 ties. Otis Bottom stopped them both, since the so-called gym teacher was nowhere around. 1 fight while running the cross-country course in PE, 1 loss. 1 fight in the boys' bathroom, a tie. James Russell stopped it. 2 fights between school and the dump, no wins, 2 losses, but they were close. 12 near fights, probable record, 8 wins, 4 losses. You don't believe me? So what? So what? 5 days of after-school detention, 2 threats of school suspension because I was the instigator of the PE locker room fights, according to the so-called gym teacher. Liar. Things were not going so well at Washington Irving Junior High School. Mr. Barber told me I needed to put a new brown paper book cover on geography, the story of the world, which I hadn't bothered doing since I was leaving it in my locker instead of bringing it to class, and I think Mr. Barber was starting to suspect that I'd taken his new book and destroyed it. I hadn't turned in my chapter review map on the culture of China to Mr. McElroy, and no, I didn't know if I was going to get it done or not. Jane Eyre still hadn't figured out that she was in love with Mr. Rochester, and I mean, how many more clues do you need? I didn't raise my hand anymore in Mrs. Vern's class, and after the first time I didn't bother answering even when she called on me. She stopped calling on me. I spent PE running the cross-country course while the rest of the class started in on the wrestling unit. No one said anything when I went out, not even the so-called gym teacher, and I didn't do anything on the next 2 lab experiments in Mr. Ferris's class. Lil did them both, even the smelly chemically stuff. And so what that Apollo 7 successfully detached from the Saturn rocket to practice the rendezvous they would have to perform perfectly for a moonshot. So what that they landed a mere 1/3 of a mile from the landing site. So what? Clarence is a stupid toy horse. Who cares if he's rocking like anything? Because no matter where I went in stupid Washington Irving Junior High School, there was the look, and the laugh, and the smirk. Jerks. And no matter where I went in stupid Marysville, there was the look, and the laugh, and the smirk. Jerks. Do you know what that feels like? I stopped helping Miss Cowper with her county literacy unit. Who were we kidding? I did do the Saturday deliveries. Guess who wanted the money and wouldn't let me stop? I didn't meet Mr. Pell at the library afterward either. I don't know if Lil was waiting there or not. I didn't draw anymore. I didn't even want to. It was like the black-backed gull had laid its head down and given up the sky. So you can see why on the day of the annual Ballard Paper Mill Harvest Time Employee Picnic, I wasn't overcome with happiness and joy. Neither was my father. It was pretty clear that Mr. Big Bucks Ballard was an idiot, he said, and that my father or Ernie Echo could run the paper mill blindfolded and do it better, 100 times better than he could, he said. All Mr. Big Bucks Ballard did was sit around his office wearing his nice white shirt and silk tie and telling everyone else what to do, he said. But he never got his freaking hands dirty. No, he didn't. You never saw him at a forklift. You never saw him backing a truck into the loading dock. Wood pulp? Big Bucks Ballard wouldn't recognize it if he tripped and fell into it over his freaking head, he said. That's what happens when you get rich. You leave all the real work to the little guy, and you sit back and enjoy all the profits, he said, and it was going to take a whole lot more than a harvest time employee picnic to change things to the way they ought to be. When my father was home, and it wasn't often, since Ernie Echo came over most nights and they drove off together, but when he was home, that's pretty much what he told us. So, no one wanted to go. Not to a picnic thrown by a jerk like Mr. Big Bucks Ballard. But on the last Saturday in October, my father made all of us get in the car and drive to the annual Ballard Paper Mill Harvest Time Employee Picnic, even my brother. You can imagine how happy we were, especially when my father said that Mr. Big Bucks Ballard was the skinflint of skinflints, and there probably wouldn't be much to eat. And what there wasn't going to be all that good. You don't expect a jerk and a skinflint to be grateful to his employees, do you? The only reason we were going, he said, was a trivia contest. And this trivia contest, according to Ernie Echo, was all about Babe Ruth. And who knew more about Babe Ruth than my father? No one. And I'm not lying. Do you know how many World Series home runs Babe Ruth hit? No, you don't. But my father did. 15. You probably know that in 1927, Babe Ruth hit his famous 60 home runs in a single season. But do you know when he hit 59 home runs? Probably you don't, but my father did. 1921. Do you know how many home runs Babe Ruth hit in the final game of 1928? 3 in one game. My father could tell you that and a whole lot more because he had once met Babe Ruth. He shook Babe Ruth's hand and bought him a beer, and Babe Ruth had winked at him and said, "You're a hell of a good guy." My father loved Babe Ruth. And Ernie Echo said that the prize for the trivia contest was going to be a baseball signed by a Yankee. It was probably Ernie Echo said, a baseball signed by the Babe. So we all went to the annual Ballard Paper Mill Harvest Time Employee Picnic because my father wanted to win a baseball signed by Babe Ruth. Terrific. I had to run through the Saturday morning deliveries pretty quickly, which wasn't hard, as you might remember, since not everyone knows the basic principles of physical science. Mrs. Mason hadn't ordered any donuts. Mr. Loeffler didn't have a single light bulb to change. Mrs. Daugherty's kids were playing upstairs when I came, and Mrs. Windermere never came into the kitchen. I really wish that at least the Daugherty kids had been... So what? I'm not a chump. I made it back as quickly as any human being could, which wasn't good enough for guess who. It was a Saturday that you somehow knew was going to be one of the last beautiful days of fall. The sun was shining hot like it was still July, and November drizzles were a whole season away. The sky was blue, and a few white clouds were easing themselves along like they didn't care. The grass was warm and sweet like April, but the trees hadn't forgotten it was October. They were all on fire, and behind their leaves the birds were singing their last songs. Waves of heat shimmered above the stone wall, and the granite sparkled. "Such a beautiful day," said my mother. My father didn't say anything. He was probably thinking about Babe Ruth. The annual Ballard Paper Mill Harvest Time Employee Picnic was always held at Mary's Lake, and since we got there late, we had to park about a mile away, all because my father said I hadn't finished the deliveries on time. Not that it mattered, since Dago couldn't hurry up if there were an atomic bomb on his butt. But even from a mile away, you could smell the chicken grilling as soon as you got out of the car. And you could hear hollering and cheering. People called and waved at each other as we walked toward the lake. And then they waved at us, and 2 women came to meet my mother and took her by the arms and brought her over to introduce her to someone else she had to meet because they didn't live very far from each other at all. And hadn't they seen her this fall at St. Ignatius? My father and brother and I passed by some long tables, and someone called out to us, and my father grunted back, and then the someone looked through a bunch of wrapped packages and picked 2 up and called to me and my brother and handed them to us. Inside was a Timex watch. I'm not lying. A Timex watch with a second hand and a real leather band and numbers for regular time and numbers for military time. A Timex watch. Compliments of the Ballard Paper Mill. My brother looked at me. I looked at him. Sometimes, and I know it doesn't last for anything more than a second, sometimes there can be a perfect understanding between 2 people who can't stand each other. He smiled, and I smiled, and we put the Timex watches on, and we watched the seconds flip by. It was the first watch my brother had ever owned. It was the first watch I had ever owned. My father looked at our wrists. "The metal will turn your skin green," he said. "Wait and see." I did not know that so many people worked at the Ballard Paper Mill. It looked like all of Marysville was there. There was a group playing volleyball, and no one was even pretending to keep score. There was a baseball game going on, husbands against wives. I guess you can imagine how funny that was. My father went over to stand with Ernie Echo to laugh and smirk. There were about 10 guys throwing horseshoes, and the clangs and the cheers that came from them made it seem like it was all fired important, like it probably was to a bunch of chumps. I went down to the lake, and it was so hot that there was a whole bunch of kids swimming, which I decided not to because of you know why. And about 8 teams were doing chicken fights, and some were diving off each other's shoulders, and James Russell was there, and he waved at me to come in, but I shook my head, and he nodded. And drifting over everything was the smell of grilling chicken, and the snap of buttery fat, and when it fell in the fire, and the smoke that drew up over the baseball game, and the volleyball and the horseshoes, and drifted over to the rows of long tables with bright white cloths over them, where the women, including my mother, were setting out the bowls of salad and plates of rolls and pitchers of pink lemonade and platters of corn on the cob that were steaming in more bowls of salad until people started to crowd away from the baseball game. And then one of the cooks by the girls hollered out, "We're all set here!" And everyone came and found a place in line while the cooks carried the long trays heaped with chicken, and the smell in the hot blue air was so wonderful, and I looked over at my mother, and she was smiling to beat the band, like she had come home after a long time away. It turned out that my brother was the first one in line. There's a shock. But it didn't matter, because even if the whole town of Marysville had been there, they couldn't have eaten everything that was loaded down those tables. It was like something out of a fairy tale. When a platter was empty, it got lifted away, and another one, even fuller than the first, magically appeared in its place. And there was more chicken cooking, and more vats of hot water with steaming corn. And then onto the line came all the kids from the lake who were dripping wet, and they were all hollering that it didn't matter if they ate like sogs because they were just going back into the water anyway. And then everyone finished the salad and chicken and corn and trying to sit back and rub their stomachs, and then big aluminum carts being wheeled across the lawn, and every kid in the place running to them and reaching in for lime popsicles and strawberry shortcake and ice cream sandwiches, and James Russell grabbing me and yelling, "Come on!" And I was running over too and reaching for an orange dreamsicle. An orange dreamsicle. You know how good an orange dreamsicle tastes on a blue fall day when you're full of grilled chicken and your mother is laughing a real laugh like she used to, and once you look over and your father is holding her hand like they haven't in a long, long, long time? Until Ernie Echo came and she walked away. Then all the mothers cleared the tables and swept off the long white tablecloths and, all laughing, folded them together and boxed up the extra food, and there was a lot. The kids ran down to the water again, and James Russell yelled, "Come on!" But I shook my head again. So he ran down to the lake, and I tried not to hate him when he took a flying dive and skimmed into the water, came up laughing, and some little kid was climbing on top of him for more chicken fights. Then most of the adults started to gather around the cleared tables, and I went over to the deserted horseshoe pits to see what was so all-fired important about throwing horseshoes. Someone yelled that the trivia contest was going to start soon and everyone should choose a partner to work with. I looked back. My father was standing with Ernie Echo. They were whispering together. They'd probably win. I picked up a horseshoe and threw it. It came up short, by a lot. I tried another. It came up short again, by a lot. I heaved another one, long, by a lot. Terrific. I threw the last one. It hit short again, but rolled until it flopped in the sand near the post. Not bad. Which is what an old guy said when I went to gather up the horseshoes. Not bad, but I think if you hold on to the bend, you might get a little more distance. I picked up the 4 horseshoes. You want to show me? He took a shoe and held it with the ends out. Like this, he said. He walked over to the post. You stand with your heel here and swing it back. He did this a couple of times. Then you release it on the upswing, which he did. It wasn't a ringer, but it clanged the post. Everything after that is just practice, he said. So I tried it. I stood with my heel like that and swung my arm a couple of times like that. I looked at him. He nodded. So I let one fly like that. I think, he said, you might want a little more arc to the throw. That way they won't run away after they hit the ground. I let another one fly. Short. Too much arc. Not bad, he said. I handed him the last shoe. I'm not a chump. He took the shoe into his hand like he had done it 1.5 million times. He set his heel. He swung his arm. The horseshoe left his arm and carried up into the blue air. It turned once slowly like it was taking its time. As it fell down toward the post, it threw out its 2 ends like a diver and dropped into the sand without even bouncing, without even touching the post, but circling it so perfectly that it was like someone had walked up there and set it down that way on purpose. I looked at him. I told you it's all practice from here, he said, but what I could use some help on is a trivia contest. I've been working at it for 25 years and never even come close to a ringer. He held out his hand. We shook. Partners, he said, and we went over to the cleared tables. Back there, a few kids were eating the last of the ice cream sandwiches, while a bunch of the men had lit cigars, and their long smoke whispered up into the golden trees. Piles of yellow pads and pencils were on the tables, and partners were taking them and writing their names on top. Some of the partners were pretty serious about it all, and they sat there numbering their pads. This was my father and Ernie Echo. Most were leaning back and laughing, probably because they didn't know 2 cents about Babe, and they figured they weren't going to win anyway. They were right. Then some guy wearing a tie at a picnic. This guy stood up on a chair and held a black notebook over his head and everyone cheered. I figured the guy with the tie must be Big Bucks Ballard, the jerk who didn't know how to run the paper mill as well as my father and Ernie Echo could blindfolded. The trivia contest questions, he hollered, and everyone cheered and clapped again. 10 questions, he said, and a tiebreaker if we need one. The team with the most correct answers is the winning team. The prize this year? A baseball signed by... Okay, you're going to think I made this next part up, but I didn't. Sometimes you just have to trust me. This is what the guy with the tie said. A baseball signed by Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, and Joe Pepitone. Cheers from all around except for my father and Ernie Echo. Plus, this year, a $50 bonus for each partner. You can bet there were cheers at this. Plus, assigned parking spots right by the mill entrance for 1 whole year. I guess this sounded good to a whole lot of people since there were a whole lot of cheers with this too. So let's get started. A baseball signed by Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, and Joe Pepitone, who, if you remember, were the 3 Yankees to hit home runs in Game 6 of the 1964 World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals. Who cares, and Mr. Big Bucks Ballard is an idiot. I looked at my partner. Do you think we have a chance? He asked. You bet, I said. Question number 1, said Mr. Big Bucks Ballard. He was still standing on the chair. How long was Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak in 1941? My partner looked at me. Do you know? He said. I took the pencil and wrote down 56. If he didn't even know that one, I thought he wasn't going to be much help. Are you all ready? Come on, folks. Either you know it or you don't. I wouldn't bother guessing if you don't. Next question. How many consecutive scoreless innings in World Series play has Whitney Ford pitched? Groans and laughter all around us. Are you kidding? Someone hollered. I handed the pencil back to my partner. 33 2/3, I whispered. He wrote it down. Next question. In the 1960, the Yankees hit more home runs than any other team in baseball history. How many did they hit? More groans, more laughter. I whispered 193. My partner wrote it down. Okay, ready for an easy one? Cheers. What 2 years did Roger Maris win back-to-back MVP awards? Even I know that one, said my partner. He wrote down 1960 and 1961. All right, let's see how you are with batting averages. What is Joe DiMaggio's lifetime batting average? 325, I whispered. What was Mickey Mantle's best batting average for any year of his career? 365, I whispered. What was the team average for the Yankees in the 1960 World Series? Groans. 338, I whispered. Calm down, calm down. Calm down, said Mr. Big Bucks Ballard, pulling at his tie. He must have gotten hot. There have to be some hard ones to separate the men from the boys. Apologized to Mrs. Stenson there. Laughter. Okay, try this one. How many American League pennants did the Yankees win under Casey Stengel? My partner looked at me. 10, he said. I nodded. He wrote it down. Question number 9. We all know that in 1961, Roger Maris broke the Babe's home run record with 61 home runs. How many did Mickey Mantle have in that same year? 54, I whispered. My partner wrote it down. The last question. Which 5 years in a row did the Yankees win the World Championship? That I can remember, said my partner, and he wrote down 1949, 1950, 1951, 1952, and 1953. I was at the last game for every one of those, he said. Every single one? I said. He nodded. There's no pleasure in getting to be an old coot unless you have some fun along the way. Do I need to tell you that when Mr. Big Bucks Ballard read out the answers, we had every one right? Do I need to tell you that my father and Ernie Echo did not? Do I need to tell you what my father thought about that? Or what my father thought about a trivia contest on the New York Yankees that didn't even have a single question about the Babe? But it wasn't over yet. When Mr. Big Bucks Ballard asked if anyone had gotten all 10 right, 3 teams raised their hands. Terrific. Here you were all grumbling and carrying on, said Big Bucks Ballard, but I guess it wasn't as hard as everyone thought. He took a sheet of paper from inside the black notebook. So now we go to the tiebreaker question, and this time I admit it's a doozy. Okay, here we go. for just these 3 teams to see who gets the baseball, the bonus, and the parking spots. Ready? You all ready? Okay, and no help, folks. Ready? Okay. What is important in baseball about the number 216? It was like all creation stopped. It was that quiet. Could you repeat the question? Called one of the teams. What is important in baseball about the number 216? I watched the other teams. You might as well have asked them to name the atomic numbers of all the inert gases. My partner looked at me. I have no idea, he said. I whispered to him. Are you sure? He said. I nodded. Really? Really. How do you know that? I counted once. He smiled. Not like my mother, but it would do. Does anyone know? Hollered Mr. Big Bucks Ballard from his chair. The other 2 teams shook their heads. My partner kept smiling. He leaned down to me. Tell them, he said. So I did. But if you think I'm so all-fired smart, you won't think so after I tell you what happened next. There was some scattered clapping, and Mr. Big Bucks Ballard came down off his chair, walked over, and shook our hands. How did you know that last one, kid? He asked. He counted once, my partner said. Mr. Big Bucks Ballard worked at his tie some more. He looked really hot. How are we going to award these prizes? He said. He looked at me. You're not driving yet, so you don't exactly need a parking spot, and it's hard to give you a bonus when you're not even working at the mill. We'll figure it out, said my partner. Then Mr. Big Bucks Ballard looked at my partner. And how about you? You know you're not supposed to win. How come? I said. He laughed. Kid, how do you think it would look if the boss won all the prizes? Pretty bad, I said, but you weren't even playing. Not me, he said. He pointed to my partner, but he was. I looked at my partner. Bob Ballard, he said, and held out his hand. The ride home was pretty quiet except for my father, who pointed out how unfair it was not to have a single question on the babe, not one, and how the whole contest was a setup anyway. Mr. Big Bucks Ballard knew the questions all along, because how else could anyone know the last question about 316? 216, I said. He glared at me in the rearview mirror. Don't you get it, he said. He set you up more than anyone. He just strung you right along and made it look like you were answering when he knew the answers from the beginning. What a freaking cheapskate. He didn't want to give away the money. He didn't want to give up the parking spots. He probably doesn't even have the stupid baseball. What a con artist. He probably didn't figure that anyone would see right through him. Did he even give you the baseball? He told me to come to his office tomorrow after school. You shouldn't count on anything. That's the way it is in this freaking world. You're nothing but a jerk if you do. I looked over at my brother. He was polishing the glass face of his Timex watch. Maybe my father was right. I didn't go to Mr. Big Bucks Ballard's office on Monday. I didn't want to find out if that's really the way things were in this freaking world. Here are the stats for the first week of November. No fights in the downstairs hall, even though I came close. 1 fight in the upstairs hall, a loss. 2 fights in the PE locker room, 2 wins after I showed I would kick just about anywhere. 2 fights in the boys' bathroom, 2 losses. There might have been a whole lot more fights in there, but I stopped going. You're right, it was pretty uncomfortable. 4 fights on the way home from after-school detention, 4 losses. After school detention on Friday, I decided I didn't want to make it a week with 5 consecutive losses on the way home, so I gave the jerks who were waiting the slip by going out through the gym entrance. I had to hope that so-called gym teacher wouldn't see me, which he didn't, and across the track and out the back field and around toward the dump. It took me right past the Ballard paper mill, so I figured, why not? When I got to the mill, and I'm not lying, you know when you're getting close to a paper mill and it's not because of the pretty scenery. When I got to the mill, I walked around to the mill entrance, facing the river. Right by the front door, right next to the stupid front door, in the best parking spot in the whole paper mill, my father's car was parked. Next to it was Ernie Echo's pickup. He never said a thing, not one thing. He went inside where a woman on the phone smiled and raised her hand to tell me she'd be a second. It was a swell place, a really swell place. Thick green carpet, paneled walls, pictures of the board of directors, lamps with green shades, red leather furniture, and by the windows, looking out to the water, plants with long stems and these flowers that, well, it's hard to describe. They didn't even look real. The woman hung up the phone. They're orchids, she said. Mr. Ballard grows them. Most of these will be gone in a week or 2. Gone? When they start to blossom like this, he sends them to his old employees who still live in town. You're Douglas Sweattick, aren't you? I nodded. I'm Mrs. Stenson. I'm sure he'll see you. Just Just let me call in." But she didn't need to, because the door in the paneled wall opened, and there was Mr. Ballard himself, silk tie and all. My partner," he said. "Mrs. Stenson, have you met my partner?" She smiled, laughed. Come in," he said, and I did. I guess I don't need to tell you about what his office was like, except that it was mostly like the room outside, but one wall had pictures of Mr. Ballard throwing horseshoes with a whole lot of people I didn't know, and a couple I did. Mayor John Lindsay, and I'm not lying, President Lyndon B. Johnson, which he saw me looking at. "Never throw horseshoes with a Texan," he said. "They don't like to lose. So, partner, what are you going to do with the $100? He went and sat down at his desk, put his feet up on it, next to a long tube. I looked at the tube. "If you ask me, and you don't have to, since it's your money, I'd put it in a savings account for college. It would be a good start." $100? "The $100 I sent home with your father. When you didn't come by on Monday, I gave it to him for—" He stopped. He took his feet off the desk and leaned forward. "You didn't get it." No, I said. "No, I got it, thanks. A savings account for college is a good idea." He stared at me for a long time. "What?" I said. "You didn't get the baseball either." "I got it. It's great. It's in my room right now. Thanks." "You sure?" "I'm sure." It was just like my father said. You shouldn't count on anything. Mr. Ballard sat back, nodded, smiled a little. "So what can I do for you?" I looked out his windows, past the orchids on the windowsill, and down toward the river. It was wide, and the trees on the far side were starting to shake their leaves down. It was getting colder. "You practice horseshoes here?" Mr. Ballard had horseshoe pits down by the river, and we played in the cool with the sound of water in our ears, and the clanging of the shoes against the posts when he threw them, and the thud of the shoes against the ground when I threw them. Here are the stats. Mr. Ballard threw 4 ringers in a row and 5 in a row another time. He had 14 ringers altogether, and 6 leaners, which still count, by the way. I had 1 leaner, which, you remember, counts, and I had 1 ringer where the shoe wrapped itself around the top of the post, spun around a couple of times, and then dropped into the sand. I think Mr. Ballard was happier about my ringer than I was. "Doug," he said, "you got the arc just right on that one, and it doesn't matter how many times it spins around as long as it comes down flat like that. And just so you know, I don't think I really stink at horseshoes. You should know that even though that was the only ringer I threw, I did come close 4 more times, and I rang the post twice, and even though it doesn't count, it still isn't bad." "A little more practice," Mr. Ballard said, "and you'll be a better thrower than President LBJ ever hoped to be. You come by any time, okay? The shoes will always be waiting for you." He set them down against a stake, right here. We walked back up from the river, and Mr. Ballard told me to stop by his office, and he'd have Mrs. Stenson see if she could find us some lemonade to celebrate my first ringer. And when we got up there, Mrs. Stenson was standing by his desk, and there was someone else there holding a stack of frame pieces, and a picture of a bird from you-know-where was spread out on Mr. Ballard's desk. And Mrs. Stenson said, "You're just in time. We're down to 3 choices for the yellow shank." And Mr. Ballard went over to see. I did too. It was about as far from the black-backed gull as you could get. The yellow shank wasn't the first thing you saw at all. You saw his world first. It was fall, and the grass was getting duller, and the trees were gold, and that reddish brown that looks like the color of old bricks. The yellow shank was walking in a sunny spot, looking like he owned the place. The water in front of him was dark, and the woods beyond were darker still, really dark. But Audubon knew something about composition. He kept the top of the bird's back as straight as the horizon, right smack in the middle of the scene, with a beak held up just as flat and just as straight, and an eye that said, "I know where I belong." You couldn't help but be a little jealous of this bird. I leaned in close. The lines in the water matched the line of the bird's beak. That would be easy to get. What would be hard to get were the legs. The back leg was poised as if it was about to leave its toe hold and push ahead, and the whole way of it, said that the head and back wouldn't be moving at all, just those legs. How did he give you the way the bird was going to move, even though he didn't show him moving? "Any closer, and we'll have to frame you too," said Mrs. Stenson. "I think," said the guy holding the stack of frames, "that if you're going to put it over the bookcase there, you'll want this mahogany frame to go with that wood." "But we're not sure it's going there," said Mrs. Stenson. "It could go by the window, as if the bird were looking outside. Then the mahogany wouldn't do at all." "What do you think?" Mr. Ballard said. I looked up. He was asking me. I think it belongs back in the book, I said. I know, that made me sound like a jerk, a real jerk. I didn't even mean to say it. Mr. Ballard had supposedly already given me this signed baseball and $100 and stuff. I was wearing his Timex watch. I should just shut up. But he asked. The guy holding the stack of frames looked at me like I was trying to take bread from his mouth. Mrs. Stenson looked at me like I was going a little too far, and Mr. Ballard said, "Why?" "Because," I said, "things belong in the class to which they have been assigned." The guy with the stack of frames put another one on the corner of the print. "Perhaps the mixture of the darker and lighter tone in this one would allow you to hang the print in either spot," he said. Mrs. Stenson looked down at the new frame, then back at me. Mr. Ballard drummed his fingers along the edge of his desk. He looked at me, then at the yellow shank, and he let his fingers light on the sunny spot beneath it. "Let's roll the thing up and put it back in the tube," he said. "I think I heard a ringer." There aren't too many things around that are whole. You know, you look hard at most anything, and it's probably beat up somewhere or other. Beat up or dinged up. Or missing a piece or tattooed. Or maybe something starts out whole and then it turns into junk, like Joe Pepitone's cap getting rained on in a gutter somewhere. Probably you can't even tell it's a cap anymore. Probably you wouldn't even want to pick it up if you saw it. But it didn't start that way. It started as Joe Pepitone's cap, and when he was out in the field, the sun was beating down on it from above the stands of Yankee Stadium, and he could smell the grass and the dirt of the infield beneath its brim. When you find something that's whole, you do what you can to keep it that way. And when you find something that isn't, then maybe it's not a bad idea to try and make it whole again. Maybe. I mean, what would you do if you found a baseball with only 215 stitches? Wouldn't you want to put in one more to make it right? I know that all sounds cosmic, but that's what you would have thought, too, if you had been in the Marysville Free Public Library the next day when I brought the tube back in, and when Mr. Powell took one look at it and knew what it was. You would have thought it, too, when we went back upstairs and Mr. Powell slid the yellow shank out of the tube and opened the glass case and turned the pages until he found the place between plate CCLXXXVII and plate CCLXXXIX and laid the print back in. And if you looked at Mr. Powell's eyes, you would have thought what I thought. I am going to get the birds back. The Arctic tern, the stupid large-billed puffins, the brown pelican, and all the rest of them. I am going to get the birds back, and I'm going to start drawing again. Ernie Echo came by for supper that night before he and my father were going off somewhere to look at a new pickup that some idiot was selling for some price, a whole lot less than he should be selling it for, and all he wanted was $100 down payment. It would be a steal, Ernie Echo said, eating another ham slice. And would I pass the mashed potatoes? My mother didn't say anything. She wasn't smiling. I went down to the mill yesterday, I said. My father and Ernie Echo looked at me. My mother did too, with worried eyes. She held her fork in midair. "Yeah," said my father. "I guess you two got the parking spots I won," I said. "So," said Ernie Echo, "it doesn't cost Mr. Big Bucks Ballard a thing. Just makes him look good to all the little guys who work for him," said my father. "He said that he gave you the—" "He didn't give me a thing," said my father. "Did you see me bring anything home? Did you? That's because he didn't give me a thing." "He said that he gave you the signed baseball and $100. My father put his two hands down flat on the table. He looked at me a long time. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm telling you what Mr. Ballard said." My father's hands twitched. "If Mr. Big Bucks Ballard said he gave me the signed baseball and $100, then he's a liar. You got that?" You know what I should have said? Even my brother knew what I should have said, because after what felt like a whole long time, my brother whispered, "Doug's got it." My father looked at my brother. "Shut up." He turned back to me. "I said Mr. Big Bucks Ballard is a freaking liar. You got that?" Then I figured it out, how Audubon got the yellow shank to move. He's staring into this dark place, and he's just about to cross the river that divides him from it, and his back foot is halfway up because he's about to push off, and he knows what he's getting into, but he does it anyway, calm and smooth and straight. He's going to step into the middle of the picture, where he should be, with the light in back of him and the dark ahead. His whole world is waiting for him to do that. I was waiting for him to do it. I looked at my brother. Even though whatever is in the dark is waiting for the yellow shank, he's going to do it anyway. "Someone's a liar," I said. Here are the stats for that night. He missed me the first time because I leaned away. He missed me the second time because I pushed the chair back and got up. He just clipped me when I had to push through Ernie Echo's arm, the jerk, and he missed me again when I spun around and got to the back door first. I count that a win. I went back to the Marysville Free Public Library and stayed until it closed at 9 o'clock. Mr. Powell had left the book open to the yellow shank. That bird, he knew where he was going, even if he was going on stupid yellow legs. He knew. But that doesn't mean anything is going to be easier. When I got home late that night, my father was gone, my mother was in her bedroom, and my brother was flipping baseball cards all by himself, which tells you something about how much was going on between his ears. I started up the stairs. "Do you know what a jerk you are?" he said. "Shut up," I said. "All you had to do was say I got it. That's all you had to do." I leaned over the banister. "Don't you ever want to say I don't got it just once? Don't you ever want—" "Every day, Duggo," he said. "Then why don't you? Because after you left, Duggo, who do you think he hollered at? Who do you think? That's why she's upstairs, so you don't see her face, because she's been crying since supper. Do you get it now?" I sat down on the stairs. "Do you get it, Duggo? Do you get it?" "Shut up. It's not like you—" "Like I what? Like I what, Duggo? Do you ever wonder what it's like to be so angry that you—" "And then something happens, and after that, everyone figures that's what you're like, and that's what you're always going to be, and so you just decide to be it. But the whole time you're thinking, am I going to be like him, or am I already like him? And then you get angrier because maybe you are, and you want to—" He stopped. He wiped at his eyes. I'm not lying. My brother wiped at his eyes. "Go upstairs," he said. "There's something on the dresser. Put it somewhere he can't find it." I started up the stairs, and Duggo, he said, "Even if you're a jerk, you still got guts." Yep, my brother said that. I'm not lying. "And you know what was on the dresser, right?" I carried the baseball downstairs. "How did you—" "Drunks keep everything they want to hide in their cars." Flipping baseball cards, wiping at his eyes, flipping baseball cards. I went down to the basement and put the signed baseball in the pocket of Joe Pepitone's jacket. When I went back into our room, my brother was deep under the covers, his face turned away. "Thanks," I said. He didn't answer, but I got it. On Monday, it was like I was walking into the center of the picture. I got a new brown paper book cover for Geography, the Story of the World, and decorated it with an Arctic tern on one side and a yellow shank on the other, right in the middle of the paper. When Mr. Barber walked by my desk holding his coffee, he opened my book and flipped through the pages, which were perfect. "Thanks for taking care of it so well," he said, and when I nodded, he smiled and hit me lightly on the shoulder, like Joe Pepitone would do. I turned to my chapter review map on the culture of China to Mr. McElroy and added a list of Chinese characters and their meanings that I wrote myself to make up for being late. Not bad for someone who, at the beginning of the year, could hardly, well. In English, when we got to chapter 38 of Jane Eyre, which I had read twice already because of Miss Cowper's County Literacy Unit, Miss Cowper turned to me and said, "Let's have Douglas finish the novel for us." And I looked at her, and I started to sweat, and I looked down at the page. You know how many words in Jane Eyre have more syllables than any word has a right to? But you know what? I got it. I really got it. Most of it. Lil Spicer said I was the best reader of all, which was a lie, but so what? So what? I raised my hand in Mrs. Verne's class, and even though it took a few tries, she finally called on me. And I'm not lying when I'm telling you that no one else in the class had even imagined a Z-axis. Mrs. Verne was pretty impressed and said that I must have a fabulous visual imagination. Did you get that? Fabulous. In PE, the wrestling unit was still going on, but the so-called gym teacher didn't say anything when I ignored the lineup platoons and went outside to run. It was November now, and most of the trees had dropped their leaves off and were all bare and dark. But as long as the so-called gym teacher was going to let me run, I'd run. And it didn't hurt any that James Russell and Otis Bottom started to run with me, and I didn't ask them to. They just saw me going outside and decided to come along, I guess. We mostly ran without saying anything. And in Mr. Ferris's class, imagine yourself handing in lab reports that get Clarence rocking his little wooden hoofs off, and you have it. So after school on Monday, I asked Lil if she wanted to walk over to the Ballard paper mill, and she said why. And I said I'd show her how to throw horseshoes, and she said how hard can it be, and I said harder than you think. And she said she guessed she'd try, and so we went down behind the mill to the horseshoe pits. The shoes were there just like Mr. Ballard promised. I showed Lil how to hold the shoe at the top, how to stand with her heel at the post, and how to swing her arm a couple of times. And she threw the first one about 10 feet, which isn't, in case you don't know, even in the neighborhood of how far it has to go. Then she threw the second one 10 feet again and got so disgusted that she threw the third one as hard as she could, and it hit on its side and rolled almost all the way to the post. Then she figured that she had the technique down, and she threw the last one as hard as the third, except that she didn't let go until the end of her swing, and the horseshoe went straight up into the air. She screamed and ducked and bent over her. And I bent over her and held her so it wouldn't hit her when it came down, except it came down next to us instead of on top of us. And when we stood up, she looked at me like I'd done something noble and heroic. You know how that feels? Fabulous. Then we collected all the horseshoes and walked over to the other post, and she said, "Why don't you throw one?" And so I did. It was perfect. I swung my arm twice, let the horseshoe go just right, and it flew up, slowly, gracefully, and then it turned once and let its two ends come down, and it landed flat and skidded on the sand just enough to ting the post. It was a beautiful sound that, well, I'm lying. I missed the stupid post by a mile, but it doesn't matter because something else happened when we finished throwing horseshoes that was even better. Reader, I kissed her. A quiet walk back we had, she and I.